Hey, look at this. We're in the truck. We're in my truck, actually. Well, today I got Stephen Watson with me, so I thought I would take this opportunity to talk about the Magnum box. Last time we got together, we talked a lot. We did a big walkthrough of the trucks. I'm going to post that video up here, so you guys can go check that one out. Right around in his head. It'll be right over his face, right here. So you guys can go check that one out if you want to see that. But I put the Magnum 205 in my truck about a month ago, and got a trip under it with me now, and I just thought, I got the guru. Let's talk Magnum, let's talk doublers, let's talk reduction boxes, and some of the differences, some of the reasons you'd want them, you know. So traditional setup, you're going to have a high and low gear with your 241 or your 203 or 205, whatever transfer case you've got in there. The benefit to adding, and there's more, I mean, when you go to start twin sticking, you get, we won't get into that right now, but adding a reduction box in front of my transfer case basically takes all the reduction in the transfer case that you've got stock and exponentially magnifies it. So there's a couple of benefits that I wanted with that. First and foremost, you have a crawl ratio that will pull you up stuff with just limited drama. No more throttle romping to get you through things, no more potentially braking stuff. You can put it in a crawl.
That's what low gearing's always been about, is control.
Yeah.
Is letting you slow down, well, in torque multiplication.
Yep.
This is why Toyota guys like having multiple gearboxes with extra low gears in them.
Marlin crawler.
And they'll run 5, 6, 8, whatever times reduction gear ratios, because they don't have torque.
Yeah.
When you've got a 4-cylinder in the front and you're still turning 1 tons and 40s, you have to create that torque somehow.
And
you either do it with gearboxes or you do it with an engine, and we do pretty well making it with a V8. That helps a lot, but you still have to have some reduction, and no matter what you do, you can have all kinds of torque up in the front, but if you don't have the gear reduction, you can't slow down. And that's one of the things you talk about, bashing your way through obstacles.
Yeah.
That's something we see directly in racing stuff. In race cars, you generally don't run super low gears because you got to keep moving and you bash your way through obstacles. Well, recreational rigs are not built like that, and you end up tearing up the rig when you're bashing stuff out. So being able to slow down and really control the movement of the vehicle just makes everything go through smoother. Yeah,
yeah. And it's also, it's easier on the vehicle all the way around. I mean, you're not having to beat up the transmission, you're not beating up your joints, because it's just not breaking traction is always preferable.
Yeah, well, and that's another thing, is there are places where if you break traction, you stop moving.
And
you don't
start the obstacle over.
Yeah, you can carry all kinds of momentum and on, and if you just, there are times that you just can't spin the tires, and we've been in those situations that things have to move. You want to know that your tire is doing this, and you can't make that happen with torque converters and clutches and engine speeds and all that without low gears.
And the 205 has always been a very, very popular. The reason being, the 205, just in a nutshell, it comes in an iron case. Unlike a lot of the newer stuff that's aluminum. That's a debate that we can have, but the bigger thing is you get all gear. Instead of having a chain, you have a full straight cut, I think it's straight gears, in the 205.
Helical cut gears.
Helical, but you're never going to break them.
Gear to gear. Yep,
and so
super strong case.
The 205 is what you want for hardcore crawling, but it comes at the cost of low gears. I think the 241 is like 273 or something.
Yeah, 272.
And then the 205 is 196.
196. Yeah, so
that's a significant. That's 30% reduction in gear ratio.
A big jump, and especially in a world where, depending on axle gears and tire sizes and engine combos, all that, give or take, good rut crawling off-road gearing is in the ballpark of 4-to-1.
Yep.
Overall.
Yep.
So the 205 is halfway there for serious crawling situations, and the beauty of it is that it's all the way there when you need wheel speed. And that's just what we've been talking about, is here in Moab, the terrain tends to reward wheel speed better.
Yeah.
The terrain's more open, momentum plays in a little bit more. Gearing combos that are a little bit higher do really well. we've been out on the trail with several guys that don't have low gear systems, and they get around in certain obstacles like rock stars.
Yeah.
They make it all look great.
Yeah.
And somebody that has a low gear transfer case set up that's either a 2-speed, if your transfer case is a 1-to-1 or a 5-to-1, you don't have choices. Even a 4.3 like the Atlas, 4.3, you either have 1-to-1 or that gear, and if your transmission doesn't work right to get you into something in the middle, you don't have any wheel speed.
So what he's alluding to here, I think, is basically you get the best of both worlds.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
get that massive low, but when you don't need the low, you still have an appropriately geared ratio for just the basic
middle
stuff.
Gear.
You're not. Traditionally, you've had to do one or the other. So so explain. Let's talk about doublers and how that fits in the whole family lineage.
So way back, 20 plus years ago, people started figuring out that certain transfer cases were modular sections. So the Toyota world is a kind of a parallel thing.
Yep.
Their transfer cases have a gearbox at the front and then a section that transfers torque to the front axle. Well, the old 203 chain drive full-time case is built the same way. It's got a gear reduction box and then a chain case that transfers the power to the front. So in the beginning, there was the doubler, and in our terminology, the doubler is the 203 reduction box. It's actually it's 2.01. It essentially doubles your gear ratio. It's where some of that came from, and somewhere in there, everything morphed to where if you've got 2 transfer cases, you have a doubler.
Yeah.
It's double cases. So there's some terminology there, but regardless, we've got this modular gearbox that we could put in front of a 205, and now you've got the best of both worlds.
Yep.
You have a middle gear for wheel spin, whether it's mud, snow, a higher speed sand stuff. We find ourselves using low range, just doing forest service roads, slower speed stuff, so you can shift up in the transmission rather than just hogging on something in first gear. You can run up in second or third gear,
Which is what I've been doing this week.
which saves the transmission.
Yeah.
So
I've been running a lot of stuff in second gear.
Yep. So you've got just a broader range there with the transmission. So we kind of commercialized the doubler. There were other people building those, and I didn't know it at the time. I saw all the pieces and started kind of putting things together, and then found out that I think there's guys been building this stuff in Iceland since the 203 came out, in the mid 70s.
They do
early
things
70s.
differently in Iceland.
Yeah, yep.
Go look up Icelandic snow trucks. They're amazing.
There's a lot of cool stuff. So we were doing the 203 doubler kits, and they're a little bit more limited. We can adapt a 203 reduction box to just about any transmission, most of them. There are some kind of holes in that system. The boxes are big and heavy, which they're extremely robust, but it is big and heavy. So as we went through all of this, there's this collection of features that we wanted and couldn't make happen out of the 203 with a spur gear, and that's where we jump into the Planet system. So then you start looking at a planetary. Instead of having a spur gear that stacks vertically, you have just a Planet that is almost the same diameter, and everything is concentric within that space. So that's how we can take the Magnum and still have a gearbox that's 8 inches across altogether, and put it in front of the 205, and you don't have stuff hanging down or sticking off to the side, and it's lighter, it's more compact. Like a 203 doubler system adds, I think the gearbox with our adapter is 115 pounds, and that goes right in front of your 205, so it just adds directly in.
It's a lot of gear.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a bunch of weight and spinning stuff, and the Magnum adds about 35 pounds because the box system is smaller, and when we replace the input shaft with the intermediate shaft of the reduction box, it's one piece.
Yeah.
You're putting it all together. So
Mine showed up on a pallet, and I put it on my trans jack and put it in.
yeah, it's super straightforward. It's still chunky. I mean, the whole thing together is 170 pounds for Magnum and 205 together.
Yeah, it wasn't
but that's
like-
not over 200.
Well, and then the other thing you mentioned real quickly is the length. So I had a 241 with a slip yoke eliminator on it. Just terminology here, the slip yoke is that cone that comes off the back of a factory 241 that you basically have the slip from the drive shaft up at the transfer case. By taking that off and going to a non-slip, like a double cardan on the transfer case, and moving the slip down to your axle, you're improving quite a few things, angles, but mostly you're just building a stronger transfer case.
Yeah, you're short and building a longer drive shaft and shortening the whole thing up, and that shortens the 241 up to where it's a pretty compact unit.
But the 241 with the slip yoke eliminator, I had that in my truck. The overall length, I think it's an inch longer or something. And my front drive shaft extended. I had to shorten my rear drive shaft 1 inch. That's awesome.
It's pretty compact.
It's nice to not have to run a Jeep length drive shaft.
Yeah.
You know, because
no, that's nice. The fact that it's small diameter, the piece in front of the 205 is not giant, so it's not hanging around. The another big one is we were able to make it rotatable. So we've got everything bolts up with a round bolt pattern in the front. There's a series of holes on the front that you can put the mounting studs in and clock the whole system. So you can clock that front drive shaft up if you've got the vehicle for it.
So you leave the Magnum box where it sits in the best location. So you've got like the selector up on top and you can still get to your ports, but then you can clock it so that you can get a flat belly if that's...
You can raise the front drive shaft up, and...
If you're into that sort of thing.
Well, if you have a vehicle that'll take it.
Yeah.
And that's where, on a lot of full-size trucks, I have one where it's turned completely flat, and it took a lot of stuff to do it. It's... the front suspension's designed around it, it's a lot, but being able to rotate it up just a notch or two
is great.
It helps pick up the belly clearance and just make things better. And that's the thing, you have that ability with the Magnum. You can put it where you want it.
And this, you're not doing it with a clocking ring, which is going to add another point for it to start leaking, and then you're bound to what the clocking ring has, and you're adding another piece in,
this
so you
is all
got
just
more
built
length.
in.
Yeah, it's. I'll show you in some B-roll right here, where the box, you can see all the different bolt patterns on it.
Yeah. So that was a major feature that we were looking at as we moved.
I didn't clock mine at all. I haven't needed
I have
to.
a saying, I quit praying to the gods of belly clearance after I built my Blazer with a completely flat belly pan, but the transfer case is inside the vehicle for the most part. It has a giant hole in the floor, front suspension's designed around it, front drive shaft is, we have to be very careful with it. It's
so that
for extra angles.
Yeah, that's an important point.
Yeah, so keeping a happy front drive shaft, it's one of the things that we tell people is that needs to be a priority. Just having four-wheel drive is way more important than having a transfer case that's tucked way up. And you can skid plate the belly too.
And what he's referring to here is, as you clock that front drive shaft up, you're increasing the angle on the front drive shaft down to your axle. So it's rob Peter to pay Paul. You're getting that flat belly, but it's at the cost of angulation, which can blow up drive shafts. So it's don't chase that. And just for the record, I have mine's clocked normally. It's just down where it is. The biggest obstacle, so Cliffhanger Trail, the gatekeeper on not the gatekeeper, but the waterfall right in the beginning is a pretty significant 4-foot plus drop. And I dropped right onto my belly skid. It's the only time I hit it this week.
Yeah.
I mean,
slide right over it.
Yeah, you slide right over it. It's not
right on.
So
it's not super dramatic, but as this goes into vehicles where that belly clearance does matter, then it's there. You can clock it up and make it work. So that's the cool thing, is it's all built. It's built in. You have the choices. If you build a vehicle and things change and all of those parts go into something else, which is pretty common. Being in this, as long as we have that, definitely happens. It's easy enough to reconfigure it to work in another vehicle. It works out real well.
So okay, so now we've got the terminology down. You've got the doubler, you've got a 205, you've got a reduction box, you've got a Magnum. You guys are starting to get familiar with the different pieces about it. let's get a little bit more technical and talk about what you added to the Magnum that is the unsung hero.
So the reason it's a Magnum, and one of the biggest features of it is kind of, I guess we saved the best for last, is the Magnum shaft. And this is where you can insert some pictures of,
the fat shaft.
The fat shaft. And to start back closer to the beginning again, in a 203 doubler system, or any system, regardless of whether it's a 203 range box, when you're putting a reduction box in front of the 205 that's a standalone reduction, you're feeding the 205 with typically a 32 spline shaft, or sometimes smaller.
Yep.
I mean, there are systems that use the factory 27 and even 10 spline input gear system on the 205, and those get pretty small. They're an inch and an eighth-ish.
So let's dial back. So intermediate shaft, you've got your output coming out of your transmission that mates into your input shaft on your transfer case, in this case on the Magnum, and the splines engage into the female end on the shaft, which is part of the Magnum box. Then inside is your intermediate shaft.
Yeah.
It's what basically connects the four-wheel drive aspect of the vehicle to the to the transmission.
Yeah. So if you look at it in modular pieces, you have a transmission that the input side takes the engine, feeds it out, multiplies torque, does its thing, and has an output shaft. Then in our case, we have a gear reduction box, the Magnum or the 203 reduction box, and that takes torque from the transmission on its input side and has an output shaft that feeds the transfer case. And as you go through that, if you have an engine that's making 200 foot-pounds of torque, you go through a transmission that multiplies by, let's use 5 to 1. Now you have 1,000 foot-pounds of torque that's coming into your reduction box. Well, if you multiply that by 2 to 1, like an old 203 system, to use a round number, now you've got 2,000 foot-pounds of torque going into the 205, which is 2 to 1. And then now you're feeding 4,000 foot-pounds of torque out of that. And I 200 foot-pounds on the engine isn't that much.
No, that's
we're just getting started.
I think that's a RAV4 now.
Yeah, that's pretty basic stuff. It's what you would find as you're easing around through obstacles. So you can see where it's possible to get some pretty big torque numbers as you get back farther in the drivetrain, which is why we need big axles also, because they're downstream of all of this.
And the aspect that we're focused on is this. It's not
the whole.
gears.
This is the reason for the shafts.
It's not. You're not running gears that are made. The gears are mated to the shaft, but they're not part of the shaft, and so you still neck down. The shaft is the major diameter of the shaft is what's going to carry the load, no matter what. You're not going to break a gear. You're going to break, well, maybe not the Magnum shaft, but that's
possible,
what's carrying the load. And this is where there are differences in different boxes. There's multiple planetary boxes
with pretty much every standalone box system, and our doubler is one of them because it's the way the system has to go together. We have a 32 spline output shaft feeding a 32 spline input gear on the 205, and that's what you get.
Yep.
So that's it's about 1.25 inches diameter for the working diameter on that shaft. And when you start putting all these pieces together, it's possible to break it. And with our
its
203,
location sucks.
Right. Yeah, you're talking before the transfer case. So if it breaks, you don't have front or rear drive. I've actually broken a tranny output shaft on a trail here in Moab, and
of course
you're happy to have. Yeah, I have.
Is there anything you haven't broken on a trail out here?
I'd have to think about that one. You're happy to have power steering because the engine runs, but that's what you have. There's no drive.
And I like to. I run 1350 U-joints on all my drive shafts. I don't run 14As. I leave that for the axles because I want a, quote, fusible link in my powertrain, a fusible link
the transfer case
that
works,
I can get to.
You're going to get one end or the other.
Exactly.
Or maybe 3 wheels. Maybe you break one axle and you get 3 wheels, which is a giant step up. So essentially we agree that breaking the transfer case is a really bad place to break stuff.
Yeah.
And
you're not fixing that with a welder.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to put that together. So
you're basically rebuilding an entire transfer case.
Yeah.
Like, if you carried a spare shaft, I mean, you'd be rebuilding.
You're pulling transfer cases out on the trail, which is
and pulling it apart.
a pretty major operation to take it apart.
Not fun. Not fun.
So this is where the Magnum comes in. So instead of having a 32 spline shaft feeding out of the reduction box, feeding the 205, we built a new input for the 205 that is a 1 3/4 34 spline that is what takes the torque from the Magnum reduction gears. So now we've got a shaft in there that is strong enough that you can do anything with it. And this is where we can dive really deep. The important thing is the Magnum part is the Magnum shaft. When you see a picture of it next to a 32 spline, it's very obvious that it's big.
Yeah.
And you can't break it. That's the big deal, is you can run it any gear combo, everything works fine, you can't break it. And that lets you use the gear reduction pieces by themselves any way that you want to also. And
what he's referring to here about can't break it is that whole torque multiplication that goes down stops at that Magnum shaft. And if you are running something that is not as large as the Magnum shaft, if you are trying to get into those deep low gears, you are on potentially borrowed time, depending on your engine and your foot and the terrain.
Weight, traction, all those things.
But by having, it's like a 14 bolt. You put a 14 bolt in because you know it's never going to break. It's designed, it's future-proofed almost. Well,
they're hard to break.
Kevin manages to break them somehow. And I think we shared a 60 or 14 bolt housing. Yesterday,
which is super unusual.
That's insane.
And just odd tangent. Things break.
Things break, but if you can
really transfer cases, we do a pretty good job. They don't really break.
No.
Which is good because they're a pain to fix. So if we want to dive really deep into why this Magnum shaft is a big deal and lets you run any gear that you want to, if we step back to a system that uses a 32 spline shaft for the input on the 205, the thing to think about is that theoretical 4,000 foot-pounds of torque that we created before with only 200 out of the engine that's up there. That's not a bunch of engine torque. This is very achievable in a trail situation.
Oh yeah.
So you take that 4,000 foot-pounds of torque and run it through the transfer case. Well, 4,000 foot-pounds is about what it takes to break a 32 spline shaft. So that's, you go through all the torque numbers and that's about what it is. So if you're feeding a number, and if we look the opposite direction, I guess is the place to start, because there's two sides of torque. One is creating it, one is resisting it. And that's where trucks come in, really any vehicle, but tire size, weight, and even axle gearing all factor into what is being transmitted through the drivetrain. And you have to have both sides.
There's reduction down at the axle with the ratio down there.
There is. And that's why a big heavy vehicle with big tires is harder on drivetrain parts, because you're resisting the engine torque even more.
Yep.
So if we start working from the axles up, if we know that you can break a 32 spline shaft with 4,000 foot-pounds, well, you have one on the rear output and one on the front output also. So if you load both of those up, you've got 4,000 foot-pounds of torque on both of those pieces. Well, it takes 8,000 foot-pounds to the front. It's, I mean, either one of those 4,000 pound numbers, if it goes straight through, is going to break the input.
Yep.
And
which is where now you can't really, that's why we talk about a true 4-speed.
This is where, and that's if you're in high gear. You know, you've got 4,000 on both sides, 8,000 comes in, 2 4s go out, you break all of it, or some of it. When the 205 is in low gear, now you can have 4,000 come in, 2 to 1 reduction, and you get 4,000 on the front, 4,000 on the rear, and all of the shafts are evenly loaded. And this is where our 203 system survived, because there's no reward to drive that with the 205 in low or in high gear. You just, when you have 2 to 1 and 2 to 1 from both boxes,
you can get that ratio somewhere else.
There's no reason to have it in high gear.
Yeah.
So you can't have that situation where you've got 2 4s breaking the input. You're always going to have that 2 to 1 reduction in the middle. So in the 203 system, it protects itself. And that's just because the ratios happen to work out that it's 2 to 1, 2 to 1. There's no reason to run the 203 in low with the 205 in high, because that same gearing is available doing it the correct way. Well, fast forward to a 2.72 reduction now in the Planet box. Well, now that's enough different that you're going to want to run that by itself in some situations.
So what he's referring to is running the Magnum box, and this is where you get the 4 speeds from. Magnum box.
And this is the really deep technical dive into why all of this happens. It's
because there's multiple different scenarios in which you'd want to run, but you can run the Magnum box in low or high. You can run the transfer case in low and high, and you can run them together as a combination of those two. So you get your Magnum low, transfer case high and low. There's 2 speeds. Magnum high, transfer case low and high. There's 2 more speeds. All with different ratios, all usable, and they all have their. You've just got more control. Going back to what we were saying in the beginning, you can pick the gear for the terrain,
right for the situation, or that's right for your vehicle combination. If you have, depending on what you have for engine, transmission, axle gearing, tire size, all those things factor in to what gear works right in a specific situation.
And that's what I'm still learning, right? Because I've got so many to play with.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a learning curve when you factor in transmissions. You potentially have multiple gears available in the transmission to work with. And that's another thing. But the big deal is you can find it. You're not stuck. So that's huge. But that's where the intermediate shaft size of the Magnum, to skip back to all of that, lets you run the gears by themselves, because now you can have the 205 in high, have your 2 shafts that are just about to break at 4,000 foot-pounds.
Split.
And the input will take 8,000 foot-pounds. It's fine with it.
So one of the things that kind of cinched the deal was I was cruising through an old pirate thread, and they were talking about various different boxes, and Hell's Bells jumped on there. And
Matt Thorson.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know Matt, he competes in the 4400 class in a truck called Hell's Bells that runs 54-inch Baja claws.
I think he stepped down a little bit now. He might be running some smaller tires, but for a long time he ran 54s.
And he wrote, I ran a Magnum box for years. I've never broken anything. And I'm like, if you're not breaking it with Baja claws.
Yeah, he broke lots of other stuff around it, like giant chromoly.
He was running
Rockwell stuff.
He was running
Rockwells. Yeah.
2.5 ton
Rockwells, big stuff. 54-inch tires. So he's got the traction side of the equation really dialed. There's a lot there.
Yeah.
And the engine side, he has an honest-to-God LS9, the factory GM blown motor.
If you're gonna do it,
do it all the way. And I don't know what he's running for output. I mean, the things are 630 horse to start with gobs of torque. So it's all good stuff.
So I'll do another video on various options, but so we've got a doubler. You've got reduction boxes that you can buy, like the Eco Box and things like that. How does this play with an Atlas? Because that's the big one. Everyone's like, and we'll talk Atlas 4-speed at this point.
So the Atlas 4-speed is a pretty parallel system. The layout is overall the same. They have a planetary box, and then behind it is a spur gear transfer case that has some reduction in it with multiple options. Realistically, they don't have a lot of usable options, I would consider, in that the 2-to-1 reduction of the 205 is very useful. The Advance has a 1.5-to-1 reduction, and I don't know if they saw that with their 4 speeds. But from there, you get up to a 3-to-1, which in some specialized situations, you might be able to use the nearly 9-to-1 gear reduction that you get out of that. But it's going to be so slow that it's hard to build momentum, and it's probably going to build in some big gear splits. So really, their most popular thing is the 2-to-1. So it ends up being very similar to what we do gear-wise. The biggest thing is just the pure size of the parts. The 205 gears are bigger, the case is more robust, it's got a different bearing system on the idler, it has tapered rollers on the idler that, in place of straight rollers in the Atlas, that make it a more robust system there. And Advanced doesn't run a giant shaft in between them.
Yeah.
The Magnum shaft system is kind of our deal on the 205. So
that's where if you're having a hard time digesting all the numbers and stuff we're throwing out, just think of you've got an intermediate shaft in the middle that no matter what is going to be carrying torque. And if you don't upgrade that and match it to the capabilities of the gears that you're putting in, you're on borrowed time.
Yeah.
And
at the very base level, what most people understand is upgrading axles, like you were talking about earlier. And this is the same thing. When you upgrade axles, you get bigger axle shafts that can carry more torque because you're creating more reduction. You've got a bigger tire that's resisting more. And it's that same concept. You just have to make the parts bigger as you use them harder.
And so what people don't recognize, and I'm going basic information here, but like if you've got a stock Dana 60 front shaft, it's going to have the same outside diameter. It'll have different spline counts depending on how it's cut, but what happens is they neck them down, and so you end up with not only a stress riser potentially at that point, but you've got a thinner shaft. And so when you upgrade to chromo shafts, you're generally going to go to a higher spline count, and you're going to go to something that is consistent in its overall diameter. It's not going to be changing and getting thinner.
Well, in torque world, diameter is king.
Yeah.
It is the key to making things strong. Materials, it's very easy to double the strength of a shaft by making it larger. It doesn't take much to do that. You can't double the strength of any shaft in an automotive application by throwing extra good material at it, because 300M 40, which is a high-end 4340, 4340 is a great material that's used in a lot of higher-end axle shafts.
These are all different steel.
These are steel alloys.
Steel alloys.
And even going up to 300M is often a 15 to 20% upgrade over a stock alloy. And that's just, it's nice, it's good. If you're playing in a world where 20%, which is not a trivial difference, but if that makes the difference for you, that it does the job. But if you can just make it larger diameter, you could double the strength of that shaft very easily, and you can run low-grade material.
Now I know with like a long alloy, so they make you're gonna get different metallurgical compounds depending on where it's going, hardness and ductility and things like that. So with a shaft, one of the benefits of a chromoly shaft is they have more I don't know if it's ductility or they can wind up without shearing.
So
Is that ductility?
They can twist farther. When you get down to it, there's a modulus of elasticity for steel, and steels are pretty much uniform across all of their grades. So they all twist fairly uniformly. What stronger alloys do is let you twist farther before it will break.
Yeah.
So
what we're referring to, like imagine you're hopping and you've got that tire bouncing. Every time that tire lands, you're shock loading that whole driveline, that whole axle shaft.
Everything
breaks.
Everything between the crankshaft and the tire.
Yeah, you're killing it all. The axle shafts actually have ability to wind up a little bit.
They wind up a lot.
Yeah, I know.
They can.
and if you actually ever see one that's been sheared through hopping, you will actually see that it was twisted off. It's not like they snap; they twist off the ends.
I have some pictures of a 14-bolt shaft from a local guy around our shop that came in to get another one.
Yeah.
It's twisted, I think it's 2.5 times.
That's insane.
It is crazy.
So my question is, do they do that? Is the Magnum shaft, or what's the Magnum shaft? The Magnum shaft, you don't want any wind up.
You can't really build that into transmission and transfer case systems.
It's too short, and then it would mess up all the
It's too short, and it's hard to build anything as far as meaningful twist into it.
Yeah.
You do see that when you get into a lot of desert stuff. They'll
300M.
they're running transaxles, so some of their intermediate shafts, their pinion shafts for the ring and pinion sets in a transaxle can be pretty long, foot and a half long.
Yeah.
And they'll build those to where the shank of the shaft is reduced compared to the spline sections, and reduced to certain points where they want them to be able to twist and provide some shock absorption for the drivetrain. But in these four-wheel drive systems, we don't have the space for that.
No.
So it really comes down to making all of this really strong, and then all of that shock absorption has to go to the axle. And there's there's some back and forth on building that shock absorption in, because you're building a certain amount of springiness into the drivetrain,
Which is
and that can
wind
let
up
everything
and
wind up and
RPM
make
and
things worse. And in general,
unpredictable.
just building it as strong and stiff as you can is kind of what we end up with to make it last and be easy to drive.
So to summarize this, because we have given, we've got the doctor here, so you guys
We're quite
just
a ways
got
into it.
I understand. I have a very working level understanding of how this stuff works, but where I take comfort is he's done the math, and it's the sort of thing where, quite honestly, I pulled my 241 out. I put the Magnum 205 in. My rear drive shaft needed to be shortened. I was impatient, and I just dropped it into front wheel drive because I actually left it in high because my VSS, whatever. Mm-hmm. I was able to drive around just in front wheel drive with this thing, and that, I know that sounds like not a big deal, but when you're taking tons of parts like donor engines, transfer cases out of older vehicles, and different axles, getting everything to play nicely together isn't always easy. And knowing that I can just bolt something in, that the research is being done into it, it's great. I mean, that to me is, I'm not beta testing someone's design. I'm not. This is
pretty well tested and proven stuff. And a great way to look at that. We've been working with with Peterson's 4-wheel and off-road on their ultimate adventure trips for, I think the Magnum was maybe the official vehicle back in 2012, the official transfer case starting then. And all of their vehicles since then have been running Magnums. All of our vehicles that we do the ultimate adventure trips have been running Magnums, and a lot of people that go on the trips have been running Magnums. And these are trips where the most extreme example is the trip a couple of years ago that we drove our 99 Chevy from Colorado to Alaska. And went 4-wheeling in Alaska.
How long was that drive?
4,000 something miles. It was a long drive. And then drove the thing home. Yeah. I mean, that's what we do.
I drove this thing out here, 1,000 miles out here, wheeled it all week, driving it back.
Yeah. You wouldn't think, when these vehicles, when a 205 was new in something in the, up to 91 in a crew cab, you could have a 91 vehicle, or up to 93 in some Dodges. You could have a 1993.
You really are an encyclopedia.
We dive really deep we dive really deep on a very few subjects. But those vehicles, you don't think about getting into one of those trucks and driving it cross country. The transfer case worked, and we haven't done anything to change that. We've really just enhanced it with this gearbox in front.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, driving it on the freeway speeds in front wheel drive, right out my shop.
Another example of that, the Ultimate Adventure in 09. I think it was 09. That was a doubler system, but running the 205. Oh, what was it? Oh, you know what? You're gonna have to cut that part out. I forgot.
I'm gonna have to edit.
You slice that part out.
Mr. Robot did not remember some numbers.
Yeah, I didn't remember what transfer case was in that thing. Turns out
I'm gonna leave this in now just to show you that he is human.
So the Whopper, actually, I thought we'd put a Magnum into that thing, but it was the 13 Super Duty we put a Magnum in. That one had a 271. They blew up the rear end, and that case was beefy enough with the Dana 80 front and a giant drive shaft and good suspension geometry for the front that we had to drive it on front wheel drive only to go find all the parts to get it fixed.
Yeah. And that is the final point we'll get into. You have the ability to, with a 205, you can modify it so that you can select whether you want front wheel drive only, rear wheel drive only, front and rear. That comes into its own where, certain off-road situations. So
that's all trail maneuverability.
Yeah, but it is cool to know that it's there.
Yeah, this transfer case system has everything that you can do with the transfer case. Practically speaking, I think that's true. I think this does everything that you can do with the transfer case. You can drive
tow with it.
Each axle individually. You've got 4 speeds to play with as far as gear reduction. The high range is just a plain high. It's 1-to-1, drive it down the highway. So there's really nothing else that you can do with the transfer case that's very useful in there.
What else should we talk about? Anything? Any cool new products coming out that you want to?
And at this point, we're really just trying to get stuff
keep up with
out.
all the orders.
Just trying to keep parts rolling. But
How is that? How's it been?
It's getting tough. Last year, we thought things were kind of tough. We had a really strong year. People were still doing stuff. 2020 was unnerving and stressful because everything was new. Having to adjust and and stay in front of everything was a challenge there. But for the most part, we could still get parts.
Yeah.
And I think what's happened is as all of the pieces in the supply chain have dried up,
The bottlenecks.
we can't get a lot of things now, and we're down to where little problems that always happen. We lost a pallet of shocks. A trucking company had lost a pallet of shocks, and they're some of the only Bilsteins of that length that we could get at all. And we got lucky; we were able to replace them. So we're shipping out back orders on that part now. But the pallet of shocks disappearing would normally just be a hiccup in the chain, and this time it was the brakes. It stopped it all.
So if you are waiting on parts, and this isn't just off-road design, this is anyone, be patient.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think this is the new normal. And now with the Suez Canal blocked, I think it's just going to get worse.
It's not going to help. I don't know that much of our stuff goes through there, but it's still.
Well, it just means
it just magnifies
supply chain.
It's another little problem that would normally be a hiccup, and is the brakes for something. We don't know what it is, but it's the brakes for something.
Yeah. So get your orders in and be patient.
Yeah, get orders in, be patient. We're giving it all she's got, Captain.
Well, I'm sorry we only overlapped by a day this time, but I'm glad we got to chat.
Yeah, the way all the trail runs and everything laid out,
it's a
this
crazy
is a 2-week
couple weeks.
deal, and we're
so full-size invasion is what I came for. That was this week, and we're now bumping into the Easter Jeep Safari, which is starting today.
Yeah, which starts
tomorrow or something.
Today or tomorrow. Their trail rides start.
We're kind of overlapping, and he wanted to be part of the Easter Jeep Safari crowd this time.
Well, we always have a booth at their vendor show. Last year accepted, of course. I'm riding with Kevin Stearns in his unlimited car, the BDS car, at the Ultra4 race this weekend. So I've got to be here toward the end of the week.
Of course, there's the BFE race too.
Right. Yeah. So that's going on.
That's next weekend.
That's
Okay.
Yeah, a week from now.
You got a crazy week.
Yeah, well, and I was planning on coming down.
Have they released
there were trail rides
the trail?
early this week that I wanted to go to.
Oh.
And I walked out in the warehouse and saw the giant stack of paper and all the stuff that we still had to do. So I stayed home a couple of days, and then I did it again. Went out and it's like, no, I need to stay here and work for another day. So ended up coming down more towards the end of full-size invasion, and then I'll stay here for a couple of days, go back home, work a couple of days, come back down for the race and the end of the show and the rest of the Jeep Safari week here.
But I got to wheel with one of his offspring, his youngest son, Riley.
Yeah.
Great driver, really basic truck. Had a lot of fun with him. He barely has his driver's permit, and he's walking most.
Yeah.
Apart from cliffhanger, he did not do the cliffhanger obstacle because his mom told him he couldn't.
Yeah.
And
my
listened.
wife very, very rarely throws the mom card, and she said nope on that.
A 2,000-foot drop on the edge of a gnarly obstacle.
That was the mom card. So
and he did. He listened.
And it's a good thing he listened.
Otherwise, the truck would be taken away.
Yeah.
And it would be on video,
it would
Riley.
be curtailed.
So,
yeah.
You made the right choice.
Yeah, he doesn't get away with it much anymore. So, but yeah, that thing, and that's an example. We talked about basic trucks out here having fun. He put all of that together for the most part himself, and just beating out rivets and bolting on parts and putting everything in. He knows all of it really well and can drive it well, and it's a combination that works well in this area. It's the old SM465 and a 205, and got some 410 gears and 37s on it, and it gets around really well down here. And
wheelbase is perfect.
Yeah, lots of fun to use, and we built a cool flatbed for it, and actually grabbed a bunch of our bumper parts and welded up his own bumper. So
Proud dad.
yeah, it's a pretty cool deal.
Yeah, it's been yeah, I've brought my family this week and it's been awesome. So plan a trip to Moab. It's a great place.
It's a fun place. Well, and it's something that I think we probably talked about this last time. The surfaces are so much different. Not everybody's going to get into the Moab scene, but getting out here and seeing the trails and driving on the slick rock is pretty huge. It's a surface that's totally different from anywhere else in the country, and it's neat to experience it and just see what it's about. There's so much hype about it. I feel like everybody, and it's kind of justified because it is really unique and
you
super
think you
fun.
know about it until you get out here and you realize amazing obstacles, great traction.
You can drive things that are steeper than you think that a vehicle can drive on, and and it's for real.
Oh yeah, escalator. I mean, I'll show you the video of escalator. I mean, the beginning of escalator is close to vertical.
Yeah, it's super steep. Yeah,
and
you can drive. Well, the drop coming off of
the waterfall on Steel Bender.
Well, that's a big one, but I'm talking about coming down from the hot tubs.
Oh, yeah, right on
when
the
you
back.
drive off of that as you're dropping down to the level where the escalator is, that thing is, I mean, you
Your
drive down
seatbelt's
it,
holding you.
you can put all of your gearing in low gear and just ride it down.
Yeah.
And you don't think that you can just drive down a hill that steep, and it's just there. You
Yeah.
just do it. It's pretty
Really fun place. So,
I guess that's it.
boom. Hit the like, subscribe, do all that you need to do. Go check out Off-Road Design, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah, if you got questions about super cool transfer case stuff, we know some people that can help out.
Give them a call. Peace.
Thanks.